For those of you who are always on the go, remember mindful moments.
Bite-sized knowledge, right?
Exactly. Perfect for those mental snacks throughout the day. Narrated by AI, too. Okay, so what if the way we normally talk about saving the planet, all the doom and gloom and all the, sacrifices we have to make, what if all that is kind of holding us back from seeing, like, surprisingly simple solutions that are already out there?
That's a really interesting question because, like you said, it really does challenge the way we usually think about these things, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today with this book, The Conservative Environmentalist by Benji Backer.
Yeah.
It's not your typical, environmental book.
Yeah.
It's proposing that a lot of the principles we usually think of as conservative, like really practical problem-solving, economic kind of creativity and just the idea of individual liberty, those can actually be really strong forces for creating a sustainable future.
Yeah, Becker really does push back against the idea that environmentalism is like a one-sided political issue.
Right.
Like it can only come from one point of view. And this book is, it's full of arguments and real-world examples that show how like a different set of values can get us to a healthier planet. So we're going to unpack all these ideas and see what we can all learn from them.
Right. And it's not just theoretical either.
Yeah.
Like the American Conservation Coalition, which Backer actually founded, is a great example of this shift.
Oh.
So it started out as a mostly conservative group, but now it's got a ton of independents and liberals in it too.
Oh, wow.
So the fact that the membership is changing like that, it really shows that concern for the environment. It goes way deeper than just what political party you belong to.
Yeah, it's a shared human issue, right?
Exactly.
Not just a political one.
Yeah, and beyond just numbers, Backer tells these really compelling stories from his travels all over the U.S. He's met with people from all walks of life, energy workers, farmers, you name it, and they're all actively trying to find practical solutions that fit their own situations. These aren't just abstract ideas, they're real things happening right now on the ground.
It's like boots on the ground environmentalism. Here.
Exactly.
That's cool. And it brings up something important. The idea that taking care of the environment is a new idea or a politically divisive one. It's just not true historically.
Right. There's a long history of conservatives leading in conservation that we often forget about.
Yeah, it's true. Like, think about Theodore Roosevelt back in the early 1900s. This guy was a Republican president, and he was like the driving force behind creating 150 national forests, 55 federal bird reserves, and 5 national parks.
That's incredible.
I know. We're talking 230 million acres of land set aside for protection. It's wild to think that someone so important in Republican history was such a huge champion for the environment. And this really proves Backer's point that conservation isn't tied to one political party. Like maybe if we understood this shared history, we could start to overcome the partisan divide we see today on climate issues.
Definitely. I think that's a really important point. And then you jump ahead to 1970, and another Republican president, Richard Nixon, created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is still like the foundation for environmental regulations in the U.S. Even in his State of the Union address that year, he made this powerful statement about making peace with nature.
Yeah, and then you've got George H.W. Bush, who ran on being an environmental president. He signed the 1990 Clean Air Act amendment.
Huge piece of legislation.
I know, it's huge. And it tackled smog and acid rain using some really innovative market-based methods.
Yeah.
It's basically this system where there's a limit on how much pollution is allowed, and companies can buy and sell permits to pollute within that limit. So it creates a financial reason for them to cut down their emissions.
It's a really smart system. And don't forget about Arnold Schwarzenegger, a Republican governor of California.
Oh, yeah.
He signed the California Global Warming Solutions Act, which put a limit on greenhouse gas emissions across the whole state.
Wow.
That move made California like a world leader in fighting climate change. These historical examples, they really challenge the idea that only one side of the political spectrum cares about the environment, and it makes you wonder why we don't talk about this shared history more.
Yeah, it's a good question for sure. Backer also talks about how people see urban and rural areas as being disconnected when it comes to the environment. He says it's wrong to think that rural communities don't care about the environment.
And what's really interesting is the idea of urbanite bias that he talks about. There's often this lack of awareness in urban areas about how much rural areas actually do for the environment, like producing our food and providing energy resources.
Right. And when you think about all that historical bipartisan support for conservation, It makes the current divide between urban and rural areas on environmental issues even more strange.
Definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
And Backer uses these examples to illustrate his point. He talks about the city dweller who's super into recycling and the suburbanite driving an electric car and then the farmer who's managing all this land that naturally absorbs carbon. They're all doing their part for the environment, but in different ways, and they all face different challenges.
Right? Like a farmer might have to use fossil fuels to power their equipment, which is totally different from someone in the city who takes the bus or the subway.
Exactly. And that's where Backer's critique of big top-down plans like the Green New Deal comes in. He's not necessarily against the main goals, but he argues that these kinds of proposals often come from an urban point of view, and they might not take into account the practical knowledge and the real economic worries of rural communities.
Yeah, he makes a good point that a lot of Americans, especially in rural areas, are living paycheck to paycheck, and they can't afford even a small, unexpected expense. So policies that make things a lot more expensive or threaten people's jobs without offering good alternatives that actually work for them are going to face a lot of pushback.
Right.
And he even points to data that suggests that the Green New Deal, even though it would cost a ton of money, might only achieve a relatively small reduction in emissions.
It's about finding that balance. And that's where the idea of incentives comes in as a possible middle ground. It's about finding ways to encourage people to do good things for the environment without just relying on strict rules or completely doing nothing.
And Backer actually tells this funny story from when he was a kid about how his parents would give him a reward for eating his vegetables.
I love that.
Right. It's so simple, but it shows how incentives can really motivate people, especially when what you want them to do isn't something they naturally want to do.
Yeah, it's all about motivation. But we also see how effective good regulations can be. Like the Clean Air Act set these really ambitious standards that forced industries to innovate.
And look at how much cleaner the air is now and how much less pollution comes from cars.
Right. It's made a huge difference.
It's had such a positive impact on public health, too, like getting lead out of gasoline.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's been really effective.
And then you have the Montreal Protocol, which is a totally different model, but it successfully addressed the problem of ozone-depleting substances. It was a more flexible approach. It focused on specific chemicals and specific industries, and it included things like support for developing countries to help them follow the rules.
So it wasn't just about punishing people, it was about working together.
Exactly. And Backer tells this story about how when he was younger, having really strict rules about his phone actually backfired. It shows that sometimes if you make rules too strict, it can actually have the opposite effect and people will just resist even more.
Yeah, that makes sense. He also compares the flexibility of the Clean Air Act with the Endangered Species Act. The ESA has good intentions, but it's really rigid, and species are super slow to be taken off the list even when they've recovered. Plus, there are these unintended consequences, like people cutting down habitat on their own land because they're afraid of getting in trouble.
Right.
It makes you wonder if it's really working as well as it could be in the long run. So what's the lesson here? It seems like it's about picking the right strategy for the problem. Sometimes you need regulations, sometimes incentives work better, and sometimes a less hands-on approach is surprisingly effective.
Exactly. And to make any of these strategies work well, you have to make the government's role more efficient. Backer thinks we should change the way we do, permitting to speed up the development of clean energy.
It's interesting because he thinks the federal government should mainly focus on big projects that affect multiple states or have nationwide impacts on health or whole industries. He thinks local and state governments are often better at handling smaller projects because they understand the specifics of those areas.
Right, they can make decisions faster and more efficiently.
And he argues that even though the Inflation Reduction Act gives a lot of support to clean energy, its nationwide approach might actually create roadblocks or miss opportunities at the local and state level, which is where a lot of the real innovation and action is happening.
It's about finding the right level of government for the problem.
Exactly. And we hear stories of CEOs getting bogged down in all this red tape trying to get permits for nuclear or wind power projects. Sometimes they end up choosing solar just because the permitting is easier, even though it might not be the best choice for their situation. Like the Plant Bottle nuclear power plant and all the regulations about airplanes hitting. It's a prime example of all the hoops you have to jump through in the nuclear industry.
It's definitely complex.
Yeah. And it's not just energy infrastructure. Bureaucracy is also slowing down nature-based solutions, like using prescribed burns to manage forests, which is super important for preventing huge wildfires. The good news is there's bipartisan support to try and cut through all that red tape.
That's encouraging.
It is. And it's helpful to look at different examples. Like California has put a ton of money into subsidies for electric cars, but EVs are still just a tiny fraction of the cars on the road.
Really?
Yeah, and sometimes the state's emissions reductions get totally wiped out by wildfires. It makes you wonder if some of these big top-down solutions are really the best way to go.
That's a good point. And on the other hand, you have these awesome grassroots programs like the composting systems in Seattle.
Yeah.
They show how powerful it can be when local communities come up with their own solutions.
Yeah, they're really making a difference.
Definitely.
But the Inflation Reduction Act does have a lot of potential to lower costs in industries that are really hard to make green, like agriculture and heavy industry. They're doing this through some cool incentives, like a tax credit for green hydrogen.
Interesting.
Yeah. And people like Ted Turner, who's doing a lot with land stewardship, and Brian Yablonsky from the Property and Environment Research Center, they both say it's really important to tap into local knowledge and let the people who live and work on the land make decisions because they know it best.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. And for anyone who's interested in AI-driven analysis of audiobooks that cover these kinds of topics, you should check out Mindful Moments and our podcasts on YouTube. Yeah, it's really interesting. But this all raises another important point about how much the U.S. depends on other countries for clean energy technology and crucial minerals. Backer talks about how risky it is to rely on countries like China and Russia, not just for national security reasons, but also because of their environmental practices and their human rights records.
Right.
It's honestly kind of scary how much we rely on them. China is like the big player when it comes to making solar panels and wind turbines.
Yeah.
And they also control most of the lithium-ion battery production.
Wow.
I know. And those batteries are super important for electric cars and for storing energy. This dependence creates problems for our supply chains and raises serious ethical questions, especially about how workers are treated in those countries.
It's a big concern. And on top of that, Russia's natural gas production releases way more methane than production in Europe or the U.S.
Oh, wow.
So if we rely on them for energy, we could actually be undermining our own efforts to reduce emissions.
Right.
Plus, there are all these geopolitical implications of being dependent on other countries for energy.
It's a tangled web for sure.
Yeah. And even though the U.S. bipartisan infrastructure law is putting a lot of money into building up our own clean energy infrastructure and research and development, we still have a long way to go.
We also have to think about the environmental impact of giant solar farms and the CO2 that gets released when we make electric car batteries, from mining the lithium to the whole manufacturing process.
It's not as simple as just switching to electric cars, right? Just think about.
Right. The U.S. is trying to create a strong domestic lithium-ion battery industry by offering tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act and by friendshoring, which means getting supplies from countries that are our allies. It's a step in the right direction, but we also have to deal with the not in my backyard problem, where people don't want mining operations near their communities, even though we need those minerals for clean energy. Yeah, it's a tough situation for sure. So ultimately, Backer is arguing for a mixed approach to energy. It's not about ditching fossil fuels overnight, but about creating a balance that includes cleaner American natural gas, hydropower, geothermal energy, and nuclear power.
So it's about having options.
Exactly. And it's encouraging to know that the U.S. has been leading the way in reducing carbon pollution since 2000, and a lot of states have managed to grow their economies without increasing their CO2 emissions. It shows that we can make progress on the environment and have a strong economy at the same time.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah, and we see amazing examples of progress happening locally, like the story of Kurt Eliasson, who fixes wind turbines in South Dakota. Now South Dakota gets most of its electricity from wind power, and they even send clean energy to other states.
That's fantastic.
Right. And sustainable farming practices like precision agriculture, no-till farming, and using cover crops have huge potential to cut emissions and make farms more profitable. Macaulay Farms is a great example of that.
So there are a lot of different ways to approach this.
Yeah, exactly. And we can't forget about how much food waste contributes to emissions. It's a surprisingly big chunk of our global carbon footprint. And nature-based solutions like taking care of forests and restoring grasslands and wetlands, those are really effective and affordable ways to store carbon.
Right.
And sometimes the most unexpected partnerships can make a big difference, like Ducks Unlimited working with ConocoPhillips on conservation projects. Who would have thought?
That's really cool.
I know, right?
It just goes to show you that you never know where solutions are going to come from.
Yeah, exactly. So in the end, Backer emphasizes how important competition and entrepreneurship are for driving innovation in the clean energy sector.
That makes sense.
Yeah, the government can help with things like the Bipartisan Energy Act of 2020 and the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's also crucial to create an environment where new ideas can thrive.
Definitely.
While ESG scores are supposed to be about corporate sustainability, they're often really broad and politically charged, which could be a problem. It might be better to just focus on evaluating companies based on their actual measurable efforts to reduce their impact on the environment.
Keep it simple.
Exactly. And it's great to see more and more universities starting environmental entrepreneurship programs. So it's a sign of hope for the future.
It is.
Plus, the U.S. nuclear energy industry not only provides clean electricity, but it also supports a lot of jobs.
It's a win-win.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting that data shows a link between countries with freer economies and better records on emissions reductions. Yeah, something to think about. And when it comes to forests, managing them properly, doing things like thinning and prescribed burns is really important to prevent those massive wildfires that release tons of carbon.
Absolutely.
And there's support from both sides of the aisle for these natural climate solutions. Restoring grasslands and wetlands is also essential for capturing carbon. But we also have to be careful about unintended consequences, like how the push for ethanol from corn has actually hurt grassland ecosystems. Successful coastal restoration projects like the one at Lightning Point in Alabama show how good things can happen when you get the local community involved.
It's about working together.
Exactly. And we can't forget about hunters and anglers. They play a big role in funding conservation and managing wildlife populations.
Oh, that's right.
Then there's blue carbon, which is the carbon captured by oceans and coastal ecosystems that has huge potential, and we need to protect coral reefs. In the end, localized energy solutions that are tailored to each region's unique resources and weather conditions are key.
It's about finding what works best in each place.
Exactly. And while some people are all for deregulating energy, the situation in Texas shows how that can lead to problems with reliability and sky-high prices. The truth is, fossil fuels are still a big part of our energy mix, but we should focus on making them cleaner and gradually transitioning to a more diverse mix that includes nuclear hydrogen and geothermal.
It's about finding the right balance.
Right. We can also repurpose existing infrastructure for nuclear power and other renewables where it makes sense, and invest in carbon capture technology and fixing methane leaks from old oil and gas wells.
Those are all things we can do right now to make a difference.
Exactly. So what we've learned today is that a real and effective commitment to a healthier climate means taking a balanced and comprehensive approach. We have to think carefully about trade-offs, listen to a variety of viewpoints, and move beyond overly simplistic or politically driven narratives to find solutions that will actually last.
I think that's a great way to put it. We've talked about a lot of ideas and solutions that you don't always hear in the mainstream conversations about climate change. The main thing to remember is that if we want to take effective action, we need to move past one-size-fits-all solutions and be open to new ideas that are grounded in reality and common sense.
Yeah, and as we've seen, this isn't something that one person or one group can solve on their own. Everyone who's listening, you have a part to play by understanding the complexities, supporting good solutions, and having productive conversations with the people around you.
It's about all of us working together.
Exactly. So as you go about your day, think about which of these solutions really speaks to you. What could your community do to create a more sustainable future? It's definitely something to consider.
It is. It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity.
Absolutely. If you want to learn more, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future discussions. And please share this with anyone who you think would find it interesting. You can also find a link in the show notes to buy The Conservative Environmentalist if you want to dive deeper into these ideas. But most importantly, keep thinking critically about the information you come across.
That's the key.
Yeah, always question and keep learning.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really great conversation.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, until next time, folks, keep those minds mindful.
Take care.